Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Cobra Kai of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka Dim Mak is my favorite Asian metal band.
And I am the black metal guy, aka Diablo 3 was an inside job.
I have not even looked at any of the information about Diablo 4. I refuse on principle.
I mean, yes, Blizzard is just bad, basically. But, Diablo 2 was a good game.
Oh, it's a classic. Diablo 2 is part of extreme metal canon, I feel.
That's right, yes.
There's a set of video games that are probably just extreme metal canon. You know?
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly all the design is metal influenced, obviously. That, and Soul Reaver Legacy of Kain.
Yes, that one.
Dark Souls, obviously.
Dark Souls, the original Doom.
Castlevania.
Castlevania, the old Infinity Engine RPGs like Baldur's Gate and Planescape Torment. That's what we'll do. We'll create a list of extreme metal canon.
Video games you're allowed to like in extreme metal.
As you hang out in your hut. You're allowed to have, a console where you can play some of these games.
Credit where credit is due. The was an inside job format is definitely the death metal guy's creation.
It's absolutely a Fed operation. That's what it was. Diablo 3 was an extension of MKULTRA designed to target gamers. All right, so. Oh god. Hey everybody. Sorry for the delay on this. I got my second mark of the beast from my second COVID shot, and I was laid up for a couple days. But my cell phone reception is incredible now, and I'm totally rethinking my opinions on like thrash and melodeath now. So it's been pretty beneficial.
For information on the Mark of the Beast, please see the official Mark of the Beast website.
Okay, so regular housekeeping. Social media, follow us. Me, the death metal guy, on Facebook at Terminus Podcast, and the black metal guy on Instagram at Terminus Extreme Metal. By the way, I've noticed for some reason when I'm doing the show, I'm doing all this like girly, like Red Scare vocal fry. I really need to stop doing that. And then if you want to get really involved, and there's a good reason to do it now. So you can support us on either Patreon or Subscribestar. Someone's going to sign up on Subscribestar one day. It'll eventually happen. Some insane survivalist will do it. But
the hut.
From the hut where they're playing the original Fallout over and over again, if it's acceptable, because it's true. So $3 and up gets you access to the Terminus Prime bonus episodes. $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Black Circle, our private Discord server. And now $10 and up gets you access to voting privileges, combining the past two tiers in a wonderful sort of harmony. So if you want some influence on what we cover on our bonus episodes, and you pledge $10 a month or more, you now have access to a private channel on our Discord server where you can vote for what album or albums will be featured in the upcoming podcasts. This is a feature we've promised for a long time, and now we've actually implemented because we have everything together for it. So if anyone is really enjoying our bonus material, for those who aren't familiar, we tend to cover a lot of older records that we really love, try to cover some deep dives on kind of obscure scenes, that sort of thing. So if you want more of that, but you'd like something maybe more specific out of it, $10 a month gets you access to the democratic process. And, I mean, who could ask for more than that? All right, we've got a show. Usually we try to do this thing where we establish some sort of meaningful thread between the albums, some sort of overarching theme. It's never something we intend originally, but we come up with it on the fly. There's none of that here. None of these albums have anything to do with each other whatsoever. But
our theme is chaos.
Yes, yes. Very necro. Speaking of necro, black metal guy, you've got the first record of tonight. What have you got?
Yeah, honestly, this is, we've talked about how nobody calls black metal necro anymore and how it's actually kind of a sound that has gone out of fashion. Thankfully, I'm happy to say we are covering Sorguinazia's Negation of Delirium on Iron Bonehead, which is a pitch-perfect execution of the necro ideal. And we'll get into what that is for all you whippersnappers.
All right, next up we have Dark Fog Eruption with The Illusion of Oblivion and Opulence. This is a translation of the title, which is written in Japanese, and I tried my best to learn how to pronounce it, but it did not work out for me, so we're going to have to go with that for now. Unsurprisingly, this is a one-man Japanese black metal project, and this is the second full-length. And kind of coming off some of the weird excursions we've made into more obscure underground Japanese stuff, this is following that trend for us. I'm really excited to talk about that one. After our interlude, it's been a few episodes, so of course the brutal death has to come back. This time it is with Neoplasia's Stirring Clots out on Grinder Cirujano Records. Neoplasia is a brutal death band from Argentina who've been around for a while, but I was not familiar with their work until stumbling across this new record. And for anyone in the know for brutal death, who your ears might perk up when you hear this, it actually features none other than Marco Petruzella on drums, which is probably going to immediately get a lot of people interested in this one. I thought it was a drum machine at first, but now it's just Marco doing his thing.
All right, and last up, I've finally done it. I've smuggled a neo-folk record onto the show. This is Bharari Ghat by Harul Vinay, out on Old Mill with a limited tape edition on Frozen Woods, a label in Italy, where I think the woods are rarely frozen. Maybe in the north, Milan. So this is neofolk with a Himalayan flavor made by a guy who, at least right now, is residing in the Himalayas. And there's some connection to black metal musically here. So, stoked to talk about that. All right, and we are back with the first record of the night, Sorguinazia's Negation of Delirium, out on Iron Bonehead. So, Sorguinazia has only done one release before this, which was an EP in 2016. That EP was released, among other things, among others, Vault of Dried Bones. Sorguinazia is from Canada and released stuff on Vault of Dried Bones. It's a 2-member project. The main songwriter, the guitarist, appears to be a lady. Conspiracy theory, this is a project with Mars Segment from Antediluvian on guitars. That's my guess. Just in terms of just probabilities. It appears, I hear some people calling this war metal because of its proximity to that scene, and you can certainly hear the inflection, right? But is this war metal, death metal guy?
I don't even know what the fuck war metal is anymore. Like war metal is a term that has loosened substantially just over the past 5 years. I mean, I know like old heads that are like, if it doesn't sound like bestial warlust, it's not war metal. I'm not quite that restrictive with it, but I would just say this is like a slightly deafened black metal record.
Yeah, it's it is. To me, this seems like a remark. Yeah, well, it espouses the necro idea of how black metal should sound, which is specifically about tone and sound quality, and maybe certain things about songwriting. Say, like putting intensity above an abstract notion of, quote, sick riffs. And yet, of course, this record has some sick riffs. But let's listen to the very beginning of it. Listen to how this sets up an expectation and then just bashes it. This is from the very beginning of the record, Black Spell of Supremacy. So you hear how that kind of clustered arpeggio at the beginning might instantly direct you to that kind of orthodox cavern sound we've been talking about on the show, right?
Oh yeah, the first time I heard it, before we got to the rest of it, I was like, oh no, what have you gotten in? What have you gotten us into again? You know?
Yeah, because that Azothist record was not great, right? And we've talked about how there's maybe a bit of a glut of things plying this vein of kind of war metal, cavernous death metal meets orthodox and dis-OBM kind of stuff, right? So, yeah, that first riff, I heard it, and I was like, oh, okay, geez, all right, this isn't how I thought it was going to sound. And then it just turns the one note in that phrase into a drone note and drops into chording under it and goes. And, that is an approach that is much more reminiscent of sort of neglected aspects of second wave black metal. Right?
Yeah.
I was especially, Dark Throne, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, there's a lot of Dark Throne and Mayhem sprinkled all throughout this record.
Yeah, I think if anything, the basic melodic structures are probably pretty mayhemic, but there's a Dark Throne interest in, I think we often talk about the interest of the parts of the Dark Throne records that nobody listens to. You always talk about the rest of Transylvanian Hunger. I always talk about the last two songs on Under a Funeral Moon. Mm-hmm. But interest in sort of focused repetition with building, not just in a static way, but building to sort of massive transitions, right? And you could hear it sort of spilling out of that drone into the main riff at the end. We talked about this a bit on the show, and I think maybe I was talking about it with the guy from Gallows, or we talked about it in the Gallows review also, maybe, that this idea of a necro style of black metal that was known in the early 2000s and sort of, I think, replaced by the phrase raw black, but raw black refers to a different sound from necro.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, necro has always been this descriptive term of a sort of atmosphere. Something I've always thought of it as something ghoulish and necromantic. A lot of the time it usually referred to stuff that was rawer than usual, but as far as like second wave black metal goes, I mean, De Mysteries is the most necro thing in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say necro is an approach to the key difference between necro and the current raw tape black aesthetic is necro is interested in power musically.
Yeah, necro wants to be heavy.
Yeah, necro's guitar tone is made to sound good, just not like it was produced in a fancy studio or with a lot of equipment.
Mm-hmm.
It's and there's it's how do you sound good on a shoestring, and how do you sound good in a way that is really how do you produce a tone that has some body to it and some force to it while also sounding kind of strange and abrasive, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, and especially that sort of focus on having a cold tone that emphasizes the higher end of the sonic spectrum, even if you're playing on the low strings, while not sounding like drill bit, kind of needly stuff or like scratchy static.
Yeah, not just pure too much gain, high frequency noise in the place of a tonal center.
Yeah, and the structures of the songs are directed towards producing, powerful body music effects, right? Rather than just this empty notion of really raw tone that's filled in with these florid poppy riffs that the vampire people like now. Right. It's
the vampire people. I like that.
Yeah. It's this is werewolf. Team Jacob, right?
Team Jacob, black metal all the way.
Yeah. So this is a very necro record. And in some ways, it could have been written back in the early 90s. But unlike a lot of the things we've been covering a lot of pretty stuff ranging from like pretty cool, like the last How to Cameo, to like really sick, like Gyandod, or who else did we review recently? That's just sounded super 90s. Oh, you like the Shavuot, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Stuff that sounds very 90s and is in various ways, people are finally producing music that really sort of gets what was great about that stuff and about sides of it that have been neglected. But where even the most sort of forward-thinking of those bands...
Wilkins agrees about forward-thinking black metal.
Yeah. Key thing is that many of those bands, at least, are... with a band like Gyandod or with Hate Spirit, less so. But a lot of those other bands are firmly rooted in how do we make something that is distinctive, but sort of musically exists back then, right?
Yeah.
This has that sound, but it is also oriented forward. This is and maybe intensely so. And it's in part because not only it could have been made back then, nobody did, but not for incidental reasons. Nobody made it back then because nobody had all the technology at once.
Mm-hmm.
So what sets this apart is, one, mastery of shaped noise. You could hear it in the tone there, you'll hear it more. But there is influence from industrial and drone music throughout this, free guitar playing, bends, feedback, stuff you got to a degree on the Antediluvian record also. And the other one is, number 2, is convulsive, intricate rhythms, right? Achieving intensity by these really fast kind of volatile moves on the fretboard. Intense sort of non-linear drumming, right? And when people did go in that direction, right, it's towards one of your favorites, Grand Declaration of War, which is more sort of remote and technical. Not remote, it's more technical.
Yeah, it's deliberately technical, using technicality to be alienating.
Yeah, this record has a kind of extreme rhythmic intensity, but not in a technical way, in a kind of very intuitive, barbaric way. Like, how can we move these chords back and forth to break people's necks kind of way. Mm-hmm. So these are both things that we heard in various ways on the last Antediluvian record. Antediluvian's more tech than this, for sure, but not conventionally, really. It makes this... it is doing something very new in a way that passes the Euronymous test. You got any other overall thoughts, or should we get into the record?
Well, I mean, I can get into my overarching thoughts, but let's start playing some music, and we can kind of pick it apart that way.
All right. Well, yeah. Well, why don't you... Do you want to play your sample then? Just play Ecstatic Karmic Impunity.
Well, I can't even announce my own samples anymore. My God.
Oh, sorry. I like
fiddle on the show.
Sorry, I like that song title so much I couldn't help saying it.
Yeah. So, Ecstatic Karmic Impunity. So, well, I mean, I guess this will kind of get into my overall thoughts. I like this. I like this more than most of the whatever we want to call it, like war metal adjacent stuff that's been coming out lately. But it feels like with a lot of this kind of music, or, you know, stuff in this vein that we're seeing, where it's kind of hewing this delicate line between old school, more traditional extreme metal and more arty, exotic ideas. I feel like pretty much all the bands we've heard thus far tend to play more strongly in one field than another. And for these guys, I think they really are at their best when they're just kind of grinding out straight up second wave black metal. And the beginning of this track, Ecstatic Karmic Impunity, is a really good example of this, because we've just got, you know, these big kind of Dark Throne and Mayhem riffs, maybe a little bit from Kraft, who are a band that I don't really like, but a lot of people I respect are really into them. But like you said, yeah, Catharsis, stuff like that. So it revolves around those kind of elemental riffing ideas, but then you've got a weirder sense of timing and, you know, kind of more densely woven rhythms, and actually, notably, a really interesting production job, which is helping to do some of the lifting on this record. So we'll check this one out from the beginning. So as you can hear, most of that riffing, it's not a one-for-one copy of anything from the second wave by any means, but it's clearly heavily inspired by Dark Throne and Mayhem, which is fine. You know, good black metal probably should be inspired by those things. But what you get is, you know, just this off sense of timing, you know, just in the interval switches that you'll hear. This more abrupt, aggressive sort of rhythmic play in general, and then
especially on the first riff, the first big riff on lead, the lead trim riff was very oddly timed. Which is one of those things that breathes some new life into some of these ideas. And then another thing is that clearly these guys are taking something from Cavern Core, which is the production style. Because it's hard to hear at first just because the guitars in this are so loud and so upfront, but they're soaked in just
absurd amounts of reverb and delay. And usually in Cavern Core, the problem is they just let it ring out. You know, it's not really doing anything. But here, in Cavern Core, it's a huge empty space. Here, it's a huge space filled with a ton of noise and just kind of, you know, clattering, dissonant reverberation, which makes it a lot more exciting, I think.
Well, you know, I like me some clattering, dissonant reverberation.
Yeah.
It's
well, how do you read this record though? Do you think that they're? I mean, we'll get into some of the, I guess, artier, for lack of a better term, sections a little bit later. But for me, I think that they're just so good at writing straight up aggressive second wave songs that just really dominates the record for me. I mean, the stuff that's a little more measured and a little more complex is cool, but I always just kind of want them to get back to this sort of thing.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think my sample might answer that. I think if there's a weak spot on the record, it's the back end, especially around Death Entrancing and Saraswati, which get into more kind of, at least in certain places in Death Entrancing, we get sort of more like skull, basically just becomes a Skullflower song at certain points, right? And that it kind of loses focus there. I think in terms of the melodic and riffing core of the music, yes, I like when it's most in touch with the second wave stuff. But here's the first sample that well, I guess the beginning of the record grabbed me, but here's the first moment that really grabbed me. This is a place where, you know, I think it is forward thinking, but again, not in a way that in a way that's pretty consistent just with the basic second wave ways of doing things that dominate this record. So here's one of the most sort of condensed sections that emphasizes rhythm and noise, but does it in a way that I think is like intuitively heavy and cool. So yeah, Conquering Skies. This is about 2.5 minutes in. So there was a part at towards the beginning of that sample that I just went back and double checked so I could try to hum it, where there's this kind of stuttered blasting, and the guitar is going something like, you know, right, sort of just climbing around on these chromatics at very choppy intervals. That is the sort of thing that it produces a rhythmic effect that's a bit like stuff that is more tech, but those are just power chords being moved quickly in kind of a way that is unusual relative to the streaming sense of melody you usually get in black metal. And the effect is like, that's like basically just a crazy headbanging moment. Clawfist.
A lot of that really is based off of just like kind of abstracted, kind of dark throne riff shapes, you know? It's like, it's definitely made weirder through the interval choice, but the overall effect of a lot of those is pretty similar to stuff you'd hear on Under a Funeral Moon.
Oh, you know, I mean, honestly, that stuttering one, I think interval-wise it would be a Dark Throne riff. Bom, 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 bom. You know, it has just those sort of clearly defined, very crushingly dissonant power chord intervals, right? But just the timing on it is not very Dark Throne-y, unless we're talking about like Goat Lord or something, right? So it's what they just do is like they break out of a conventional rhythmic form to create extremely high intensity, right? They're not being, it's not technical, it's not showily progressive or avant-garde. They're just doing it, they're doing it with the ends of, it has exactly the same ends that Dark Throne or Mayhem had. And they're simply sort of cracking and reforming the original riff structures of that music in order to make music that does those things just different. And maybe in some respect, you know, in some respects more so, right? The convulsive rhythmic effect isn't something you get in either of them, particularly at the beginning.
Yeah, and that's one of the core things that makes this band distinct from so many other kind of like nowadays second wave worship bands is that interest in these kind of dynamic rhythmic arrangements.
Yeah, and which go hand in hand with sort of, because you're changing the time, you're changing the structure of the melody. And having that stuff trading, and, you know, then because then they do sort of spiral that off into this kind of they're messing around with a couple, like one motif for a lot of the rest of that song. They do some kind of cool choppy out stuff, and then they just, you know, hit a just a stomp riff, right? Just that strut, and they hammer it for like 45 seconds at least. And that's towards the beginning of the record, right? It's the second song, and when I was hearing the choppy stuff, I was like, I was enjoying it. I was like, oh, that's cool. But I was like, what kind of record is this going to be, right? Is it going to be more?
It takes a while for the record to really define itself.
Is it
going to... a lot of different things.
Yes. Is it going to be an antediluvian type, noisy antediluvian? And then when that stomp riff comes in after, I'm like, oh, okay. What that riff says is like, we are interested in heavy metal kicks and heaviness. It's there's actually a quick moment like that on the last Antediluvian where they just rip this kind of double pedal riff. Yeah, it is it's very out there while being very metal. In that respect, this band reminds me a lot of Concrete Winds more than anything. I don't think it's as alien or as forward-thinking as Concrete Winds. A lot of it, when you look more closely at it, is more conventionally black or death metal, but it has a similar kind of way of being very faithful to the original impulse while doing it in a fresh way.
Yeah, well, Concrete Winds basically invents an entirely new riffing style, or like an entirely new set of interval ideas for riffs that we've never heard before, so we can't knock them too hard for not being as far along the path as Concrete Winds are.
Who, by the way, have a new one out in a month.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, what you want to do your sample next and keep it alternating, or go to mine?
Let's go to yours. Because I sampled one of the tracks that you didn't really like, and I thought it was actually probably my favorite track on the record.
Okay, for sure. Well, let's go to... Okay, so going to the one I like... I mean, there are a lot of really big moments on this record. I listened to this while I was cooking dinner, and, I just put down whatever I was doing to go stand in the middle of my room and flail around, and, do the claw fist thing. It is very, very heavy physical music, and the nice thing is that it does not particularly... it does not cleave to the artificial post hoc distinction between really dissonant, punky second wave black metal and more sort of majestic second wave black metal. Right? There's none of that distinction. It has all aspects of the melodic spectrum are here, or harmonic spectrum are here. We've talked about that on the show. It's just a feature of a good band that gets why the second wave was cool. There are not. And I think maybe with a somewhat benefit of hindsight, this band is good at playing up the most, say, satisfyingly epic moments in the Mayhem guitar sound. So, Mayhem style riffs being written by people who are familiar with the pleasures of Satanic War Master. Right? So, let's listen to Negation of Delirium. So the only comment I really have in my notes is Yarg.
Well, that main hook melodic riff is probably the single best riff on the record, I think.
That it is really awesome.
It's really long, really complex, goes through a lot of different moods and kind of themes, and it's great.
She's hitting those squalling high strings while she's playing one of the most sort of like Dorian scale ideas in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's at a sort of classic, like, I don't know, there's like some classic just like, whoa, da, 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 da. There's some just, on some of the most, there's no clean division between the parts of that are supposed to be sinister and the parts that are supposed to be, like, more heroic, right? It's
just
they're
all the same thing.
Yes, exactly. Yes, they're the same picture. It is a sinister aristocratic riff, and
it's what all the fancy vampire kids wish they were making.
Yeah, I guess. I don't think they even wish they do, because it's too it's too scary. It's not this romanticized erotic vampire crap, it's that's a forceful and threatening riff, and it's like, and there's a physical violence in the playing. I mean, just hitting those really soaring intervals while you're just doing sort of a flyaway fry on the high strings is really cool. There's that interest in those kind of squalling tones is very similar to Concrete Winds.
Yeah.
The way, and just the creativity and like taking time, you know, we've talked about the move towards longer riffs, right? Just this unfolds just phrase by phrase. There are like 4 phrases to it. It takes so much, it takes time. There's an idea like, why do I have to resolve it here?
Yeah, just keep going.
Yeah, that is a really fucking good riff. And point is, that's not the only moment on the record like this. There are moments where they'll just, out of the very nasty stuff, they'll just drop into a sort of like, just like, heavy, you know, sort of heavy moments.
Yeah. Well, for my last sample, you think that this record takes a little bit of a dip towards the end, and you mentioned like Death Entrancing as like one of the big ones. That's probably my favorite track on the record, actually. I think that's the one where the more artsy gestures, you know, for want of a better term, all kind of connect together. This is the longest track on the record. It's the one where I feel those ideas really have space to breathe. And certainly I've decried the whole Ortho Cavern. Okay, this is the part where it's going to get quiet and we're just going to like build up this single idea for a couple minutes thing. Yeah, I mean, I'm tired of it too. But they kind of do that here, but it's really fucking good because the kind of riff they use as the architecture behind it is really unusual for the style, because it's kind of like a Doom Crust riff. Kind of a Stormcrow or Sanctum type thing.
Well, you're really selling me on this. It's
No, it's really cool. And this is just kind of dropped smack dab in the middle of the song. It kind of, the song kind of dissolves, and then we start with this slow, melodic, kind of Doom Crust riff, and it picks up and it builds up, and then slowly, as it elaborates upon itself, it sort of spills out into a series of more aggressive riffs. And, I don't know, I just think it was a really smart, really interesting songwriting. I really enjoy that whole passage. You know, it's got that early Emperor quality of how it just constantly sort of like breaks itself down into basic elements and rebuilds itself into a different configuration. Or it's like kind of like old Enslaved in a way like that. It's one of the most like outwardly kind of progressive and ambitious parts on the record, which a lot of the times for a band like this can be the stumbling block. It's where you really start to see the kind of the cracks in the armor show. But here, I think it's one of the strongest parts of the album. I think if they do more stuff like this, because this stands up, to me at least, right alongside all the more traditional second wave inspired stuff, and if they could elaborate some more on these ideas in the future, you know, just these long involved, mostly instrumental, kind of not even developmental riff sequences, because there is no obvious climax to any of that. It's just very exploratory. But it still maintains my attention really well. If they could do more of that, I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, maybe the, well, I mean, obviously also, like, I really like this record, so I want to like it more. So I'm receptive to the positive things you're saying. And, you know, also, I think in terms of, like, feeling like the last half of the record is, slower. I think part of that is just the experience of going from the blistering ecstasy of the first 4 tracks into the slower stuff. It's just there's just a come down effect. I was very focused on how fucking sick and punishing it was, and then like it just started doing something else, and so part of me was just like, oh shucks. I'd say with this particular song, there's about 2 minutes of feedback play at the beginning that I don't know. You know what it is? It's the sequence you point out is awesome. And there's some good blasty stuff earlier in the track. But I think what I'm pointing to, that whole sequence is sick. I like the way that sort of... I think you're right to compare that to a Doomcrust riff. That's pretty cool. And the way it sort of spirals into this more black metal-y phrase, I hear that. The strange version of... The strange, even more hollow version of a Dark Throne strut is really cool there. The guitar, the sort of noise level of the guitar, whether it's probably a second track or something, the noise guitar at the end is doing some really cool, kind of, I had a word for it and I lost it, but the guitar just starts sort of like wailing and shaking toward the end, in a really cool way, sort of keening. That's all awesome. I think what I'm talking about is a pacing issue. As in, that whole sequence is great, but it comes at the end of a track that has a bunch of sort of feedbacky stuff that then sort of gives way to a cool blasting part. The cool blasting part stops, and we're back into build mode, this time with the Doomcrust riff. And maybe one track that works, but if you throw Saraswati after it, which is the interlude track, then there's an aggregate drop in momentum for about 12 minutes. So maybe if they just went straight from Death Entrance into Neuromancy, I mean, it's almost not so much a quarrel with any of the material as just overall sequencing. But anyway, yeah, that's just me trying to explain what I meant better. Like, does that diminish the overall quality of the album? Not really. I'm not a stickler about that sort of shit. Like, the parts I like, all the parts where the riffs are happening are sick.
Hey, it's Kari from Sepulchre Curse.
And I'm Jakob.
You're listening to Terminus.
Alright, and we are back with the Japanese one-man project Dark Fog Eruption. Their sophomore full-length, The Illusion of Oblivion and Opulence. Unsurprisingly, this is an independent release with several song titles in kanji, which we will not even try to pronounce. So we've covered a little bit of kind of unusual Japanese stuff on the show over the past year or so. The most obvious, kind of similar one to this record is going to be the debut record by Black Horizon Ancient Belial, which I think we covered around this time last year. It was probably it was like September, October last year. And I've gone on record being a guy that's just really into the Japanese metal scene in general. I've always found it really interesting the way they interpret, American and European sounds in different ways. But something the Japanese scene has always struggled with is kind of getting a definitive black metal sound. Japan was pretty late to the game when it comes to black metal. Obviously, they had a really rich kind of punk and thrash scene, as well as just old school heavy metal and power metal, and even death metal. They were on death metal circa 1990 with some of the earliest releases. But black metal, there's always been Japanese black metal bands in fits and starts, but there's never really been a regional scene for it, and it's kind of odd. There's no specific rationale as to why. But what goes along with that is there isn't really a defined Japanese sound for black metal. But after hearing Black Horizon Ancient Belial and comparing it to some older stuff, I'm starting to think that maybe there is kind of a Japanese sound. It's kind of gloomy. It kind of verges on DSBM territory at times. But I think also what we're starting to see is there's a lot of importance placed on stuff like Winterland and Dissection, maybe some of the flashier, melodic Black Death stuff from years past. Dark Fog Eruption is definitely within this vein of kind of gloomy drum machine based one-man black metal, clearly kind of a bedroom project. But here the influences are a little bit different. You're definitely going to hear some of that Winterland and Dissection in some of the flashier moments, but there's the core riffing on this is actually pretty similar to Seigneur Voland, which is very popular nowadays in general, but you don't typically hear in a lot of the Asian black metal these days. There's a lot of that. There's some contemporary.
A Japanese label, I think. Is it Zero Dimensional that did the Seigneur Voland reissues?
Oh, maybe. I know Horrible was doing some Seigneur Voland reissues, but I don't know about it.
Yeah, Zero Dimensional did too. And actually, they played over there recently.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's
but that makes it all the weirder that, Zero Dimensional is a pretty respected label that's done, reissues for a lot of big bands, and has had some of the done stuff for some of the big Japanese bands too. It is weird that, there are these standout, and then of course, there's everyone knows Psy and Abigail and all that, right?
Sabbat, yeah.
Yeah. But Barbados, right? That's sort of a constellation of names that everyone knows. But it is weird that it seems like such ripe territory for black metal, and yet it just hasn't totally materialized. I know what you mean about there not being a Japanese sound. I think there is. How's this? I don't think there's no single Japanese sound, and it hasn't, as far as I know. There's some deep cult stuff that certain people have followed, but as far as I know, right, it hasn't produced a sort of a consistent Japanese sound, one really big black circle or whatever, right? But there is quintessentially Japanese sounding black metal. I think you're right about, certainly it turns out, who knew Winterland is huge there, right? Because there's stuff on this record that has to be from Winterland.
As there clearly was with Black Horizon Ancient Belial.
Exactly,
We spoke to him and he was talking about, Winterland is one of the most important bands to me, you know?
Yeah, so they must be more canonical over there than they are here. Whereas here they were a relatively recent, highly internet discovery that now, like, Zoomers are discovering, right? Because it's sort of consistent. It's more consistent with nowadays tastes than, like, 10 years ago. So Vinterland's important. But there is a tradition of sounding really Japanese in black metal, which I would say is Arca Sua and Hakuja.
Okay, that's some, like... I think we talked about Arca Sua when we talked about Black Horizon Ancient Belial.
I might have done that as a interlude track.
Yeah, I think you did there. And then, Hakuja you've also mentioned. Those are a little bit later. Those are like mid to late 2000s, right?
Well, Arca Sua starts apparently founded in the late 90s, but yeah, it's mid to late 2000s. And the scene, they had a strong underground reputation when we were coming up. But that scene seems to have receded. I'm just checking on Metal Archives. They belong to the AAAA collective, along with Afdema, Anguis Dei, and Absolutized. I think people were paying more attention to all of those bands back then.
Well, another thing that I got to just thinking about recently, because someone on a different Discord server was talking about them. Have you ever heard Endless Dismal Moan?
No, but it's a relatively common name. I always ignore it because it sounds like DSBM, but...
It's kind of DSBM. It's interesting.
It's kind of a good name for a band.
Yeah, I think that Endless Dismal Moan, especially after hearing this, and then actually just as a reference, because I hadn't heard Endless Dismal Moan in a while, so I went to Lord of Nightmare, the best-known record by that project, and listened to it a little bit. I used to have a copy of it when I was younger, and it does sound kind of like this. And then kind of going back, it's like, wow, a lot of the Japanese black metal sounds a lot like this, because Chaos 9, the main guy behind that project, is, as far as I understand it, kind of like the Dead of Japan. You know, this, like, prolific tortured artist who ended up committing suicide and was very influential to the deep underground scene at the time. So I think that may actually be more of a linchpin than I understood about the whole Japanese black metal scene.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But we've done enough history. So Dark
I was going to say
Eruption.
we should probably
Yeah. So what did you think about this? So personally, I've got a lot of affection for this. I think we go back and forth in the notes about how we feel about this. I really enjoyed this record. I basically agree with some of the faults that you find in it. I think this reminds me of a lot of very cool kind of 2000s bedroom stuff that I would listen to. Just kind of, these records that flew around underground distros and were available for $5 and nobody ever bought them, except for me, because I liked just, buying random stuff I'd never heard of to try it out. This takes me back to a time where there's a pleasantly workmanlike quality to this music of, this is a guy in a bedroom making an album, and there is absolutely no effort to make it seem like more than that. There's something refreshingly unpretentious about this music. But that's enough for me. I've been talking too long. So what do you think about this?
It's funny because I have no ear for production, so it was like, damn, that's a good drummer.
One day you're going to be able to figure out drum machines.
I just assumed it was a guy from the hardcore scene.
I think that's a possibility. I mean, and Black Horizon Ancient Belial, it turned out, was a guy who was a drummer in a couple of pretty cool Japanese hardcore bands. Yeah,
so to me, going back over it, there's definitely parts that are good. There are some very good riffs on this. I think the most dependable parts of the record are those that have this Japanese sound we've been talking about. The other big influence is mutilation, especially filtered through slightly later French bands like Celestia. But it's a particular version of a better version of the vampiric sound that's become popular now. And so we can get into that. But so he's very good at one style of black metal riffing that seems characteristic for a number of Japanese bands. But along with that, it makes all these gestures towards stuff that, to me at least, scans as very now. Like, I get what you mean about the bedroom spirit, right? But stylistically, and about trying to make a record that sounds good from your bedroom, right? Which is different from a lot of the raw tape black stuff, right? This isn't this record isn't trying to win cult points, and I do like that. It's got a powerful guitar tone. The guitar tone is cool. The guy picks really, really fast, which can take certain riffs that aren't that interesting and make them quite powerful. Like at the beginning of the record, he just plays one minor six over and over again, and it's really heavy.
At this point, I just assume that everybody in a Japanese metal band is like some sort of like absurdly skilled musician slumming it. Because that's definitely a case here. This guy's a ridiculous guitarist who's deliberately doing very simple music.
So, but yeah, the other thing is it sounds to me like I think my overall impression at first when I heard this is it's bad. And it, not in a way that, not that it's like inauthentic or that there's some deep misunderstanding, but it sounds like a guy trying to wrap his ears around the construction of certain kinds of black metal riffs. Because at least 50% of the record is after this more kind of muscular, aggressive sound that and also a sort of more a different approach to big melody than this sort of capital G Gothic mode that you get in some of the Japanese bands. It seems like, I mean, the record starts with a imitation of a Migla riff that is one of the weaker moments. And a lot of the riffing to me, I hear the Seigneur Voland thing, but they're basically just like a bunch of progressions on here that are like two chord the riffs you play when you're first learning that Franco-Finnish guitar style with those sliding chords, and just the chords themselves inherently sound awesome to you. And so a lot of sort of chord progression-y, Sargeisty, Seigneur Voland kind of things. And those are some of the weakest moments on here. And a lot of weight is hung on them. There's a heavy metal break at one point on the record, and that also sounds sort of like, here is what a metal riff is, kind of, in general. I think my guess is there's a unique... He's sort of defined a unique idea, which is how can you make music that has this relentlessly gloomy, kind of high-stress aspect to it, while also being kind of driving and heavy, right? And I do like that. I think the overall concept is good, and I think like some of the riffs, maybe even half of the riffs I like, but I think there are enough parts of it that seriously drag that I cannot endorse the record as a whole. And it's just, it's the sound of someone like, I think it's the sound of someone who's learning as he goes, right? Not how to play guitar, but how to form melodies in this way.
Yeah, I think, I definitely get what you're saying. For me, it's kind of, the reason I like it so much is kind of like, to, kind of respond to your points, it's kind of two parts. One, as we've established, I've got way more patience for generic Franco-Finnish or Seigneur Voland riffing than you. And two, I love the kind of just weird, auteur idiosyncrasies of it. Like, the kind of learning as you go along thing is something that I really like about that. And for instance, I'll go to a sample. The opening of the second track, the huge old pendulum clock. So there's actually a few kind of heavy metal breaks on this record. I know the one you're thinking of, it's like 5 or 6 tracks in. That's like the biggest one, but there's actually a few of them. So this opens with a sort of modified second wave riff, but with a very like old school heavy metal picking style, which is a very Japanese kind of thing. And then they slide through a couple kind of simple melodic black metal riffs, but then the big hook riff comes in, which is a straight Seigneur Voland riff, like a modified version of the first riff off the Seigneur Voland EP. But then he plays this insane, like, octave bouncing bass line underneath it, which is just so fucking weird and cool. As soon as I heard it, just giant grin across my face.
All right, well, I don't remember the bass line, so I'm interested to hear this.
Yeah, check this one out. Dude, just that underneath it. What the fuck? It's so out of nowhere. I love that.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, that's exciting. It adds, using the bass percussively, right? Mm-hmm. Just by virtue of changing the interval so far, it makes a percussive kind of vibe to it, right? That's cool. That's a very Hakuja thing to do. There's free moving. Yeah, on Dew of Blood, there's this awesome free-moving contrapuntal bass that often takes the melody when the guitar sort of holds these chords. But, yeah, so I like that part. I think I didn't notice the bass when I was just playing it really loud on my speakers.
But, yeah, you definitely need you need the headphones for that.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's cool, and certainly something that you could do more. Another thing I was thinking under that riff, obviously not a huge fan of the riff itself, right? But the way that it works, the general outline of the riff, especially when you combine it with the bass and the sort of more neoclassical bass flourishes at the end, it sounds like it's patterned on part of the Soul Reaper riff from Dissection.
Oh yeah, wouldn't surprise me.
Of the darkness, you're the keeper. It resolves in the same way. And there's another riff later on this record that maybe I've actually sampled. That sort of also not quoting again, but like patterned on Soul Reaper. So I think like at first I was like, does this really sound like Dissection? But going back over it, it's like, when you were saying Dissection, but going back over it, it's like, yes, it sounds like somebody like deliberately finding sort of simpler versions of Dissection phrases.
Yeah, deliberately stripped down minimal interpretations. Because I think that's a consistent thing throughout Japanese metal, is this love of the sort of, flourish-heavy neoclassical bands, and I feel like that feeds into even relatively minimal music like this. You know, a lot of the riffing ideas of Japanese metal bands seem to in some way be sculpted around those ideas, even if they're, you know, really stripped down versions of them.
Yeah, so when he does, and so here's an example of that in terms of what do we mean by the Japanese-sounding riffing. Well, this sample from a track with a series of kanji that I cannot pronounce.
I just translated it. It translates to deformed shadows.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a classic. So yeah, this is the fourth track. I think the third track on this is quite strong. I like that one all the way through. But it's also short, sort of short and punchy. But here's the fourth track, and this sample gives you a really good example of the contrast between the parts that sound very Japanese and that to me I like a lot, and I think are well executed. And the parts that are weaker, which have that Franco-Finnish sound. And so in this sample, you hear them just switching. It's like you'll hear the good riff, you'll hear the bad riff, you'll hear the good riff. There are a couple good riffs, I think, in the sample. But and you'll hear the different harmonic language that's being used between those parts. Okay, yeah. So the riff in the middle of that sample is the kind of thing that I think is holding this record back. Just
I get you. I was thinking about that. And
you know, it's one thing to write an elemental riff. It's another thing to write a riff that is like just the general outline of millions of riffs.
I get you. You see, I think that's the thing is, like, I think that sort of thing is not so much, like, Franco-Finnish as, like, starting to learn how to write black metal on guitar. And it's one of those things that's, like, so fundamental, everyone's written that riff before. Like, when they started.
Yeah.
I have affection for the idea of putting that on a record, you know? I love the idea of putting your first riff on a record like that.
I mean, like, by all means, put it on a record. I'll just say that it's the first riff, right? I mean, it's, you know, like, sure, it's DIY culture. You're free to send your creations into the world before they've matured, but somebody's got to tell you that. You know, and is he capable of writing better riffs? The answer is yes, because
it's surrounded by them.
The riff right after that soars, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, they have this. There's an example of the particular neoclassical turn in the Japanese stuff, which emphasizes these like. There are more sort of half-step slides between chords, sort of seamless half-step slides. There's major minor modulation. Da, 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 da. It's I can't hum it right now.
Well, it's interesting because I think that what sets these guys.
Also, there's a lot of changing root notes right? You sort of create these slides between chords by changing the underlying strings rather than the overlying melody. Yeah.
Well, I think that what's a part of that is, I think, and I've got these like elaborate theories based on the history of like Western music in Japan, which I'm not going to get into, but I think that one of the things that we're hearing, especially on that first riff, that was the one that really struck me with that super dramatic root note progression, is that even in black metal, I feel like the Japanese guys have this closeness to certain like blues and jazz guitar techniques, which have basically been excised from black metal everywhere else. They are still playing guitar and arranging melodies kind of within this like blues or jazz fusion paradigm, which is really influential to like Japanese popular music. So just like the way some of these root note interactions work is something much more akin to like 16-bar blues than it is a black metal riff as we understand it.
I thought you were blowing it. I thought that was sort of bullshit, but then I listened back to it just now, and it's like
it's got that smoky, jazzy quality, yeah.
Yeah, I was. It does. It's a little bit like you know,
like a film noir thing.
It's like, you know, that I think that's which that's a Zeppelin song. I can't remember. I think it's Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You. Yeah, I sort of hear that. I mean, that could also be like, that's also this kind of like French chanson thing that seems to get in there.
Yeah. It's like,
which might be itself influenced by the blues jazz thing, but part of the Gothic thing in Japan in these kind of melodies is this. It's not exactly classical, right? It's just highly elaborate European vernacular music. That's spilling into it, and that itself has a blues or jazz influence. I
do appreciate you going back and listening before calling it bullshit.
Yeah, I was like, what the. I had to give you the fair shake, but I hear what you mean there. So I guess what I'd say is I'm not sure it's coming directly. I know that you've talked about the huge influence of jazz and blues in post-war Japan for sure. So I get that. I think, my guess would be that for black metal bands, it might be coming more directly from this kind of general sense of what kind of French stuff sounds like.
That's a possibility.
But like either way, and also it's coming from French bands. Doesn't Mutilation do shit like that?
In a much, much, much more primitive way. Yeah. This is a very sophisticated take. Well, this is what Willie would do in Mutilation, but he would like fuck up the riff and make it all chromatic and weird.
Yeah. So a band worth mentioned as a possible influence, although it's been years since I've listened to them, is Celestia. I was just doing some research on all this whole configuration of bands, but Celestia is like alternate universe Mutilation. Like, instead of people picking up on the really gutter stuff, Celestia picked up on the sort of like, you know, the melodic ideas under it, right? So there's a good example of the good guitar on here, and how do you define that style also? Maybe like extremely smooth yet extremely high tension, using these sort of very close, highly half step ideas, and yet not at all in a chromatic way, in a highly coherent way. Let's listen to your next sample.
Yeah, so now we're going to get into, I think both of us are going to get into the the stuff that's more like Winterland. And I theorized we need to put this guy in touch with Black Horizon and Ancient Belial so they can do a split together, which I have helpfully titled for them Nippon Black Magic. So So but here specifically, I think that's a cool idea because here, this band plays with a lot of the same Vinterland and dissection ideas that Black Horizon Ancient Belial was, but they're much more stripped down and minimal. But this is towards the back end of the album, and I think that's where those ideas start to flourish more, and you start to get away from that sort of crypto DSBM stuff from the first half. And this is from a track called Lunatic Romance. Yeah, no, the mutilation you were mentioning really comes out on that very last riff on that sample. That could be directly from like a mid-era mutilation record.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that part was all good. That was a very sort of high-density display of the kinds of riffs he's good at, and in a good sequence. I would say the last three track, that's the third to last track. I would say from there it really picks up.
Yeah, that's where it starts to really... I like the rest of the album, but you're right in that it feels like the album really finds its identity in those last few tracks.
Yeah, so what else about those sick riffs do you like?
Well, I love that very simple gestural kind of like flourishing heavy metal riff, that dun 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 dun. You know, it's such a simple idea, but again, you get that kind of black key root note fluctuation, which has that weird kind of jazzy quality to it, and then obviously that huge epic centerpiece riff with that descending bass line at the end, you know, that manipulates the descent of that riff in a really interesting way. Yeah, it's a very simple, epic riff, but then he tweaks the ending of it. Of course, that riff is going to descend, but he does it in a slightly different way that gives it more life.
That's just a really good riff, yeah. It's there he's using... I thought of a difference, like, the moving the bass note in interesting ways is also important to, say, like, writing something that sounds like actual Satanic War Master as opposed to fake Satanic War Master or actual Seigneur Voland or whatever. But the way the European bands do it is you move a bass tone, you're moving the bass note by whole steps or by, like, minor sixths to produce, like, colossally, or fifths, right, to produce these sort of, like, colossal epic moments, right? whereas there's a lot of sliding by half steps in the bass notes here. But on that big riff, the big simple riff you were just describing, he's doing more like open, more like whole step open kind of intervals on the descent. And also, I was saying as we listened, but that's basically a Japanese screamo riff, right? That could be on Envy or Swarm or your favorite Heaven in Her Arms, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And there's another riff like that on track 3, which is also of the early track 3. It's very short. It's condensed. It's like condensed, powerful. It's like under 4 minutes. And that also has one of those sort of overtly kind of screamo riffs that this guy's quite good at. Leaving aside questions of style, I would say that emotionally this record is on its strongest footing when it's embracing the kind of grandiose melancholy and getting more indulgent and sentimental, which is not often a thing I think.
I was about to say, that's usually your arch nemesis, but...
Yeah, no, I think that's the strength here. I think that's the stuff he feels, and the stuff that's like approximations of like big, bang your head, epic black metal is the stuff that usually doesn't land as well. And the epic moments, like that sort of screamo-y riff in the middle is super epic, just in a different way. All right, so for me, this is in terms of, I think, clearest example. We've been talking about Winterland the whole time and sort of beating around the bush. But here is the here's the end of the second to last song into the last song. You'll hear, I think the sample starts on a main riff to Intoxication, it's called, is the second to last. The main riff to Intoxication is not very good. And we start on that riff, but then things go places in a great way.
So you're allowed to do the Sargeist riff as long as you modify the timing just a hair.
I mean, are you talking about the last one?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that way they're doing that is just sort of basically what they do there is the same technique that he's doing on the leads before then. There's a continuity of technique. So Intoxication ends, and then it just blasts off on that riff. The last track blasts off on the riff you were calling the Sargeist riff. But that sort of like taking very simple, epic couple string chords and wobbling the sort of top note on them in a kind of pulsed way is that's what Vinderland does. And it gives instead of making it like I am playing the outline, I am playing a chord progression in a not very interesting way, it becomes there's some melodic inflection over it. And there's a lot of just messing with time like that, even if you're just wobbling between, just taking the high note on the chord and moving it a whole or a half step, right? Doing that in this kind of pulsed way gives it an individual inflection. It just puts some, you can follow a simple melodic shape over the base of the chords. And he's doing that with the leads at the end of the last track too, right? Da 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 da. It's based on just that the main part of the riff is the wiggle at the beginning. Da 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 da. And in the more sort of more high tension riff before that too. It works the same way. And that's a way of shaping melodies that's kind of like more like how singing works in pop songs, right? You hang around a root note and you kind of go up and down in certain places, but a lot of the melodies coming from the pulse, often in folk songs too. And I think he's quite good at that.
after some Hakuja, which was actually pretty excellent. I had no idea that was going to be so completely up my alley. We go to something completely different, which is Neoplasia from Argentina with their fourth full-length record, Stirring Clots, which is, what an unpleasant album name that is. Jesus Christ, I don't like the idea of that at all. So Neoplasia, like I said, full band from Argentina who have apparently been around since like the mid-90s, but really only do records on like kind of 5 to 10 year intervals. This time we've got the regular lineup of the band with the legendary Marco Petruzella filling in on drums. Anyone who's into brutal death or kind of tech death is going to know that name, but for those of you who aren't into that, Marco is probably one of the best drummers in the world, just period. He is almost certainly probably top 5 fastest in the world, which is demonstrated very clearly throughout this record.
It's fast.
It is very fast. Like I said, when I first heard this record, I assumed that it was a drum machine because it's so fast and so tight. But no, it's just Marco being Marco, and knowing him, he probably just like one take most of these songs and was just like, oh yeah, let's go grab a beer now. But so Neoplasia, I guess, is after a fashion kind of a brutal death band, but just kind of thematically and with the vibe of the music. But really what it is a continuation of a variety of tech death that was extremely popular in the early to mid 2000s, but has kind of faded away now. In that period where I was kind of first getting into extreme metal, I really loved that style of tech death. And what I'm talking about is stuff like the first Necrophagist record, the early work by Spawn of Possession, Yattering. There's a few other bands tucked into that niche, but really what it was the idea of these bands embracing this extremely cold, extremely remote, mechanized style, and not just using that to polish up the music, but really using it as an intrinsic feature of the music to make it sound colder and weirder and more alienating. The one I always go to, like I mentioned, is the first Necrophagist record, The Onset of Putrefaction, which is honestly kind of a classic to me. People, obviously, everybody has talked about Necrophagist for many years, but usually what they're referring to is Epitaph, the second record, which is much more neoclassical and has bigger hooks. The first one, Onset of Putrefaction, and let me clarify, I'm talking about the original version with the drum machine, not the re-recorded version, is just this horrible mechanical thing. The guitars don't even sound like guitars. All the humanity's been polished out of them. It just sounds like this horrible, like, mad scientist gore experiment. It's wonderful.
Are we going to do a bonus episode on that?
Well, we could. Maybe if people vote on something similar to it, I could fold that in, yeah.
So Necrophagist is tech death.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a discussion in and of itself, this whole, like, redefining of brutal death metal, because back in the day, people used to think of Necrophagist as, like, brutal death, but nowadays, we wouldn't call it that. There's kind of an arms race in that. Once you get some of the just insane shit we've got coming out on New Standard Elite, a lot of the stuff from back then looks a little passé.
Well, so what's interesting about this record is that it doesn't... It does sound to me more like the first brutal and or technical death metal I heard on the radio back in the early 2000s.
What makes you think? Is it just the kind of like dizzying technicality of it?
It's pre-slam.
Mm-hmm.
It's pre-slam. It has these kind of chugging parts. And the way it's the way the riffs are constructed, I think, like, it doesn't sound like all the stuff I heard back then. Not that I have a particularly good memory of it, but, like, the way the riffs are constructed as these sort of mazes of wildly oscillating notes that are, extremely dissonant. That there was stuff like that back then. A lot of it, to my ears at the time, sounded quite random. Right? I didn't like it. This I certainly have more time for now. But does sound... Occasionally it reminds me why I always, It occasionally reminds me of my initial prejudice of tech death and brutal death, for sure. Prejudice against. But so it doesn't have the slam stuff, and it doesn't have the 16th note chug run at all. Mm-hmm. Like, I think my gold standard for what brutal death metal now sounds like is that Exterminated record you played. Right? Which,
that is very defining for the style.
Which, even if I'll never listen to it again, I would just extremely respect it for its just consistency, right? And the kind of weird anti-atmosphere it gets. But so those kinds of forming kind of complex motivic riffs out of this sort of streams of chug being played much higher on the fretboard than aggressive chug is like tremolo chug, basically, right? This band doesn't do that, right? They're like playing trem lines or just kind of like single notes, like tapping or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of like I think a lot of this is tapping. Just extremely intricate tapping passages, like almost like Psyopus level stuff. There's barely any palm muting. There's barely any stuff that you could call a death metal riff in the way that we understand it conventionally.
And there's none of the sort of crypto thrash stuff you get in the Psychroptic brand of tech death.
No. I would say maybe the closest thing this is to, I had to look it up, was that record he brought on the show earlier this year, the one by Obsolete, Animate, Isolate, but taken way further down that kind of hyper tech death rabbit hole.
And Obsolete was very thrashy in a lot of ways. Like, almost the elements of the music, it was almost like a technical thrash record. But the parts that were very brutal death sounding were like this. I hear that for sure. I also immediately... So, okay, that's a good connection. I immediately like the timbre better on this than most brutal death. Right? The sort of, kind of, I've referred to it, but at its best, it's a particular way of making a very implacably inorganic sound. At its worst, it sounds plastic. This has a different way. This sounds inorganic in the way that, like, Converge did.
This is kind of, like, chromed off and alloyed.
Yeah. It's not exactly. Like Slam is sometimes like digital. Like, this sounds like metal. And yes, the record constantly sounds like machines breaking down.
Yes, it does.
Whereas, like, a lot of the sort of Slam-influenced brutal death sounds more just like digital hell. Right?
Yeah, well, this is not a record particularly concerned with being heavy in a conventional... It's not very bassy at all, the mixing on this.
But god really damn, it's extreme.
High tones. Yeah, it's extreme. It's deliberately flattened out. You're just supposed to pay attention to these performances.
And here, let's get to the my first sample. I've got a way of getting into it. Is just like the chug patterns on here are not like brutal death or even what death metal has become. They're really cool, and they're based on the sort of it's a version I'd never heard of playing sort of literally sheet metal sounding chugs focused on high end. So. I like that kind of amoebic chug sound or whatever, right? The scraping chug. This is like a very technical kind of version of that, and the rhythms on it sound like old Dillinger Escape Plan or like Ministry or something. I don't know. It reminds me of like Just One Fix. So listen to like Patterns of Diverted Excitation.
Holy fuck.
Isn't that... First of all, that's sick.
Jesus Christ. I always have to remind myself that that's a human being playing drums. Or really any of the instruments on this record. You know?
Yeah, that's... No, I think it's a fax machine malfunctioning. It's...
I love it. It's really like nothing else in metal. Like it really is, because that specifically, the part you sampled there is a sort of technique they're going to constantly. This like sharp stop unison chugging stuff that keeps working its way around the fretboard. It's really not comparable to anything else. I mean, the closest thing is Meshuggah, which I think they're deriving a lot of influence from, but it doesn't sound like them either.
No, it does connect to the Sorguinazia. It's just like doing things that nobody else has thought of because they seem absurd, right? To generate, like, it's just like not done. It's like not done to do something that fast or intensely, right? And for both these bands, these kinds of like high-speed rhythmic gestures are ways of generating extreme intensity rather than convolution.
It's not intended to be heavy. Like, that's not a mosh part. It's just fucking weird.
It's pretty heavy. You just can't headbang or mott. I think that part's really heavy, but not in a way that you can, like, dance to, certainly. I mean, it's just kind of, it's a thing. You know, in terms of like music that sounds material, that's just a big titanium cube.
Yes, exactly. No, I think that's one of the things that has me so excited about this record is just the incredibly alienating quality of this music. Like it's Kafka-esque in a way.
But a thing I want to get to is, you know, in terms of the machines thing, I think it almost has a retro concept of technology. Like, there's Brutal Death sounds very technological sometimes in that the tones live on the internet, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The tones live on the internet, and for better or worse, the music is like digital sphere tech. This really sort of reminds everyone that under the circuits, there's like, under the floating world of zeros and ones, right? There's like machines doing things still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's something I mentioned in the notes. Is a lot of this has an oddly industrial quality to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because something that I'll get into is the way the guitar writing on this record is fascinating. I think that any of the people in the kind of like tech or brutal death sphere should be checking out the way these guys write riffs. Because riffs on this record are used almost in the way that tape loops are used in industrial records. Their time is contorted. You know, they've got an individual phrase, it gets worked around the fretboard, and in parallel to that, they're stretching it out through different time signatures, or they're compressing it, or they're affecting it and kind of mutating it in different ways, in the same way that, you know, Throbbing Gristle would do with like a short sample on a tape, you know. Play it slower, play it faster, chop it up, add effects to it. It's really fascinating. You know, this is thoroughly inorganic music, and they really make that into a strength. Sorry, I just... Yeah, no, you can talk.
I thought you were going to the next sample. Let's go.
Oh, yeah, I can. So, Involuntary Psychiatric Containment. So this whole sample's fucking awesome. The centerpiece is going to be about 30 seconds in, where we're going to get something very similar to your sample, where you're going to get this bizarre, like, polyrhythmic chug against blast beat section that sounds like it's in 4/4, but if you pay really close attention, you know it's some, like, weird 16th note configuration instead. But then you'll get into some of the more like blasty riffing on this in this like abstract pointillistic quality it has. Everything is very like delicately tapped out on this record. Even as heavy as it is, you can tell these hands are really light and kind of dancing on the fretboard. And now we'll really get into the idea of, okay, think about these riffs as like tape loops. I love the way they keep ruining your expectations. You know, every riff gets played like 1.5 or like 2.25 times, gets abruptly cut off with a time change, and then, you know, pushed into some completely different direction. And of course that whole middle section of those like nauseating like blast beat chug riff dancing tap pattern in the other ear, it's so like deliberately, you know, aggressive and demanding of the listener. It's like you feel exhausted by the end of one of these songs. I really like it.
There's a moment that was surprisingly heavy metal to me was the way they initially have that kind of thing, going over that sort of stuttered beat with the little chug under it, and then it just it goes into a thrash beat and sort of locks in over that like a Slayer riff for a minute. Like, that's not something you get on the first listen through. But like, that was heavy. I'm still gonna say this album is kind of heavy. I mean, certainly much more than I'd expect from music like this. You know what I think it is? It sounds a lot like tech death that was very clicky back in the day, but this isn't clicky at all.
No. It's you know, because the problem was like the clicky tech death, you know, the clickiness was always to like give more room for like bass, you know, give more room for like low frequency heaviness. This doesn't care about that. You know, this is so resolutely focused on just etching out these performances in this really pristine quality that it paradoxically ends up heavier. You know, because there's nothing to latch onto, in a sense, as a listener. You're just thrown into this. You know, this kind of reminds me, you know, when I did that interview with Nikhil from Anal Stab Wound, he was talking about the idea of, you know, wanting to learn harder and harder music. The idea of brutal death metal being a sort of like physical athletic process for the player. And it's like I've started to apply that almost in the reverse direction. The idea that certain brutal death like this is almost this like physical athletic process for the listener, where it becomes so difficult to decipher. Like, for instance, Defeated Sanity would be in that basic ballpark of it demands so much from the listener. there's like a training process. You have to listen to these records a few times before you can even really begin to pick them apart. And I think that's really cool.
But, okay, well, I think there's an important difference. Like, Defeated Sanity has a visceral impact that this does not. Right?
Yeah, okay, that's fair. Defeated Sanity has slams. You know,
and it operates...
big riffs.
And the riffs are written often outside conventional metal ideas of time. But, yeah, it does have really big riffs. Like, certainly for it all to... I think it's, you know, it's more physical and it's less demonstrative. It's probably more sophisticated, but has, you know, does this record have something to prove? Not compared to like masturbatory tech death, right? But I do think there's a significant difference between demanding attention in the way that, I don't know, what would I say, like, you know, when we listened to that Defeated Sanity record, we were comparing it to, like, Mahavishnu, like Birds of Fire, or... You could compare it to, I mean, my jazz reference points are pretty shallow, but like, you know, Coltrane Love Supreme or something. It has these sort of like powerful melodic shapes in it that just move in ways that are going to be alien initially to your ears if you're used to Slayer. But like this is, I would say that this is closer to athleticism for the listener than that is. And I would say that in terms of jazz, this is closer to like hard bop, like really intense technical bebop. I don't know, like like Charlie Parker shredding scales or something. And you know, I don't like a lot of that shit just completely loses me. You know, it's sort of that stuff is sort of paragon for jazz in terms of demanding and sophisticated and like top notch improv, right? This
You can even go for something like Mingus. You know, I'm a huge Charles Mingus guy.
No, I don't. I mean, I think Mingus is much more direct.
Well, that's a weird thing I've noticed, which is a lot of people like online talk about, you know, people who aren't from metal backgrounds talk about Mingus being this like incredibly demanding, incredibly difficult music, but metalheads immediately latch on to Mingus. It's like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense. What are you guys?
No, I mean it's sophisticated. it has big low riffs in it, like Defeated Sanity. I'm talking about stuff that's like and this Neoplasia definitely has something in common with that. I have more time for it, A, because it's death metal. B, and, you know, because it does have, well, there's a weird way where pain, the best of the most really technical jazz stuff, right, will reward your attention. If you pay attention, you get some degree of physical kick from it. And that's kind of, you know, I feel like what you're getting at here is that, like, in a record like this, there's a way that, like, the immediate sensation is led by the sort of abstract thing. Like, the thinking precedes the feeling, but there is feeling. It's really weird. It's like a ghost generating a body or something.
No, I like that. It's like this is music that has to be considered. It's music in reverse. You know, it's like usually you feel something up front and then you're thinking about how they got there. Here, all the thinking is front loaded, and only after you've kind of like, you know, assimilated or digested it, then you can get to some of the feeling. You know, that's interesting. I never thought of it that way, but that's true.
Well, cool. Let's listen to some more death metal.
Fuck yeah. I've
got you know, this relates back to me. You asked me what I go to death metal for as opposed to black metal, right? And I was like, music. Oh, when I like want to think in a certain music that's like promotes a certain kind of thinking, because there's this like highly distinct forms interacting in these kinds of alienating ways, and like the structures evolving and stuff. And so like this record definitely has that. But let's go to that was something I figured out about my taste from your question, which was a good one. But Prolonged Agonizing Period.
This is a really good song.
Yeah. So this is AKA every lady's worst nightmare. I don't think that's what they mean by period, although it probably is also every lady's worst nightmare. But this is the melodic one, and there's a big riff, probably the closest to a big riff on the record, and then just listen to how it evolves from there. Da-da-dum. The song is over now.
Oh man, listening to this again, I really liked it the first time, but listening to this again, God, this is a really cool record.
Yeah, I think it's really good. In terms of rhythmic phrasing, I mean, honestly, so two thoughts. The bebop comparison is probably more... I mean, we were drawing that comparison kind of with Nick Hill's last record, too, the Anal Stab Wound, right? That especially that song towards the end that started from almost like a kind of Miles Davis, just little mini trumpet phrase, right? Mm-hmm, so there's a similar kind of motivic songwriting being used here, right? And not in the way that, like... I know that most brutal death metal songwriting is, like, you've talked about sort of having this, like, cellular unit of like notes and moving them around the fretboard, right? But a more free-flowing motivic kind of thing is happening here. You almost can't. There's that kind of you know, if you're like a guitar music guy, you might think King Crimson, right? But also,
well, it's extremely jazzy. It's just the jazz is just so goddamn fast on this. It's so.
Yeah.
This is probably the fastest record of the year that we've covered. You know?
Probably, and especially in terms of like absolute tempo is one thing, but like this feels very, very fast. Not in like a ripping way, but it's very fast. But so you get that, initial theme, and then everything that follows from it. But I challenge you to tell me where that initial theme ends. You know what I mean? Like, because there are many variations on it that crop up again and again. Even something like the original motif pops up again a minute later. But it's just like... It's not like... it's just the beginning of a structure that keeps iterating. You can't really isolate the... It's not like there's a first riff and then a bunch of other riffs related to it that come after it. Like, that whole sequence, the melodic unit is that entire, like, 2-minute long sequence.
Yeah. Well, listening to this again, I believe that... I'm starting to think that all of these songs begin... Like, it's even more cellular than regular Brutal Death, where it's like all of these songs are built around, like, a single stem phrase that they constantly return to as a sort of, like, circling pattern, except they're doing it so quickly and abruptly, and they're working it in so many different ways, you can't even decipher it as a listener.
And the way they're doing that has more to do with how organic melody works than it does with, like, kind of this, drag and drop kind of songwriting on some of these other bands. Like, this is, it's, like, very seamless and flowing, and it, I don't know, what am I trying to get at here? Like,
It's got a jammy quality, despite how insanely technical it is.
Yeah, so that's one unlikely thing. And another unlikely thing, I think I take back what I said about it not being crypto thrash. On second listen, there are so many motifs, things that happen that are just like Slayer at, like, sped up, like watching a Slayer thing at, like, 2 times.
The psychroptic comes out, I think.
I think so, yeah. And even just the way they'll do certain, like, voice the riff in a heavily syncopated way, and then lock in the boop, bap, boop, bap, boop, bap, boop. There are a number of places where a boop top comes in and you can kind of thrash to it. I mean, not like your literal body can't thrash, but your ghost body can, right? It's
for all of 7 seconds before they destroy it.
But that's a long 7 seconds. A lot can...
Oh no, that's one of the things. It's like it sounds like an insult, but it's like all of these, like, 4-minute songs feel like they're 15 minutes long.
No, absolutely.
By the time I got to the end of this record, I felt like I needed to take a fucking nap. It was so exhausting.
Yes. I think in terms of using conspicuous technicality, and I don't see that as quite what Defeated Sanity does. It's just really technical. But in terms of using conspicuous technicality to produce really heavy things, I don't know that I've heard anything that tops this in terms of the brutal or tech death you brought on here. And, like,
it's
not masturbatory at all.
If I go through, like, everything I've listened to, like, ever beyond stuff on the show, this is still probably top 5.
Yeah,
it really impressive. Is that fucking crazy.
Do you think this is year end for you?
I don't know, man. I keep hovering. Not to, get on too much of a tangent, but, the problem is I've been considering my year-end list because, we're in the last quarter now. And the thing is, it's so hard to find appropriate space for, say, some of the brutal and tech death stuff that I really love. Because when you're comparing it to, like, the black or doom stuff that I want to feature, it's like... It's so hard to compare those things. It's such an apples and oranges thing. Because, obviously, the things that Neoplasia are going for are completely different from a lot of the black metal that I've loved this year. So, it's always interesting to pit them against each other. I mean, there's certain brutal death stuff we've covered this year that's absolutely going in, my end of the year list. But Neoplasia, honestly, it is so interesting and so kind of thought-provoking as a musician. It might sneak its way on there. But real quick, so last sample. Final track of the album, Disturbing Killer Plan. I think this is, like, the most sophisticated track on the record. This is fucking awesome, everything that they do. So we're going to open with this very kind of, like, ad nauseum or, like, ulcerate section. More ad nauseum because it just refuses to find a tonal center. Like, ulcerate does bizarre, kind of dissonant stuff, but there's always a tonal center to rely on. These guys, no, there's none of that. You were just cast adrift in the sea of notes. But then it just explodes outwards into all these bizarre guitar flourishes, very kind of Gorguts circa Obscura style. But then you'll hear it kind of come together at the end of the sample. You'll get something almost like late-era Death just in fits and starts. If you peer past the madness, you can see the outlines of things off of like human or symbolic here. So that one kind of comes together a little bit more. There's something more recognizable as a song to regular people happening here, which is kind of like a relief at the end of this record, that there's something you can hang on to a little bit more. It's like, okay, there's riffs that they're settling into a little bit more. I mean, it's still absurdly technical, and just the performances are out of this world, but there are things like riffs happening.
Yeah, it's a melody you can go home humming.
I think it's more just like there's more continuous repetitions of
I know what you mean.
Actual same thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just but man, that opening of that sample, that bizarre ad nauseum dissonant stuff, it's like they hear everything that Ulcerate and Disentomb are doing. It's like, oh, you don't even fucking realize how far we can go with this stuff.
That is something I was thinking when I heard this, is just like, yeah, I mean, as people who are normally very suspicious of, quote, dissonant Black Death or whatever, right? We did like that Ad Nauseam record because it was like actually delivering the goods in terms of being sort of challenging music, right? And disorienting music. Sounding good while being not easy listening. Whereas a lot of that stuff sounds bad and is secretly easy listening. A thing I think I've been thinking about lately, how popular that stuff is, because it sounds quite difficult while actually just all sliding by at once.
Extreme middlebrow, extreme metal.
Oh, for sure. No, Dissonant Black Death is for sure middlebrow. But it's a the NPR of death metal, or black metal. But it's this is what was I gonna say? So this record just wipes the floor with all those bands that somehow tout dissonance or inorganicity as their thing, and it does so strictly within a brutal death framework. Like, you can tell they're drawing influence from Ulcerate, and obviously I'm not including Ulcerate, who are a great band within the swarms of imitators, right? But they're drawing influence from Ulcerate. They know what this bands like Disentomb or whatever are doing, but it does it pretty much all within standard brutal death vocabulary. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, just sped up way too fast.
Yeah, so, like, last question, what are the deathy parts? I thought of you as somebody who didn't like death. I mean, I don't, but, you know.
I'm not a big fan of death, but I can recognize where some of those ideas are. It's just, I mean, obviously this is stuff off, like, human or symbolic, but it's played at, like, double speed, so it becomes, like, borderline unrecognizable, but the influence of later death on technical death metal has always been a huge thing. Specifically bands like, let's say, like, I guess somewhat deep cut shit at this point, like Illogicist or Skeptic, bands like that. Even Psychroptic to a degree. Just the idea of, okay, we're gonna etch out these kind of funky melodic patterns against this thrash beat. The only difference is Neoplasia plays it on 45 instead of 33.
How's it going? Connor here from Oncology, and you're listening to Terminus.
And we are back from ranting about a number of things, as we do from time to time. What did that rant include? It included Pale Swordsman, fucking Drud, Amon Amarth, hip-hop.
Horror movies.
Yeah.
It included a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
that's why it takes so long to record the show, because in every break we take, it's like 45 minutes of us talking shit. You know?
Yeah, we have to be grumpy old men. Wilkins
agrees.
Yeah. Well, so we are back from the break with Harul Vinay's Bharari Ghat out on Old Mill, and the tape is on Frozen Woods. Also, I'm not sure I pronounced that right. Don't take my word for it. I'm going to interview this guy next week, so you'll get some fresher information. But why would I come out of Terminus interview hibernation to interview him? Well, it seems like there's a fairly interesting story here. This is a one-man neofolk project that is based in the Himalayas and in sort of northern India, on the verge of the Himalayas, and is centered on sort of the regional mythology and folklore. And includes some pretty cool ethnographic recordings of apparently never before recorded traditional musicians. Just sort of, that sort of the intro and the outro and stuff, and maybe a little more than that, but pretty cool. And I bet he has a trove of recordings he's going to draw on. But the music itself, I think we agree on what's interesting about this and unusual. Like, you might think that if you were going to get sort of Himalayan neofolk, that the melodies, the basic song forms, and most of the melodies, right, would be somehow rooted in, using Indian scales that we don't know, or rooted in those rhythmic ideas, or maybe with more of that kind of the cool percussion stuff you get on the ethnomusicological parts of the record. Not really, right?
No. Which is, it was interesting. Before we started recording, we talked about that. It's like, I'd like to, give us credit. We are better about this than most people. But at the same time, it was just when we were talking about it, it's like, yeah, I mean, why is there any reason to think that the neofolk from a guy in India would necessarily be intensely Indian, Himalayan, however you want to refer to it? It's like, he's drawing clearly on all sorts of influences from all parts of the world. So to automatically assume that this would be in every single part reflective of his origin is kind of silly in retrospect.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we assumed that, right? Remember that really terrible review we read of that is the guy?
The Imhatarakai.
Imhatarakai. God, like I thought this was going to be
we were going to have cool like Muslim chanting and
Turkish melodies. Yeah. It doesn't sound Turkish enough. Turns out it's black metal. Yeah, so
I still get angry about that.
No, me too.
We're 30 times better than that. But
the veins on my forehead are throbbing. However, there is an assumption. Like, I think it's the word folk is the thing that's the tricky word here, right? Because like, like if you think, okay, folk music, local traditions, blah blah blah, right? You'll be thinking, how can this ethnic musical base be used in the music? And it is. Don't get me wrong.
It
is to some degree. But this is a case where it's important to remember, even for yours truly, who listens to a lot of neofolk, that neofolk, right? The whole thing that's weird about it and that throws a lot of people for a loop is that it's not particularly rooted in like European folk music. Like, I mean, like Death in June, not at all, right? Rooted in sort of 60s folk psych guitar and like post-punk and industrial. Like,
neofolk is really a genre of music that inherits a lot of baggage from the use of the word folk that is not necessarily logical for the kind of music it is.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, it inherits a concern with folk culture, right? And, regional specificity, pagan tradition, all that kind, anti-modernity, all that stuff, right? But it doesn't have the, it's not, it's like folk music as an idea, right? Not the thing. And, sometimes we've talked about how that's often related to, bad guitar work in neofolk. Like stuff that is, you're playing acoustic guitar, but because it has nothing to do with actual actual folk guitar, which involves finger picking or colorful strumming or, whatever, right? It can be very, very bland. And that's a thing that neofolk fans talk about all the time. It's maybe the one genre where its most avid fans agree that most of it's trash. It's like I think any fan would agree with that. And so like this record admirably does not do that. So what's interesting about this is both. I think it has a more. So it's using neofolk as a generic base in the same way that like an Indian black metal band would use black metal as a generic base, and you get flavors of Indian. Maybe in an Indian, if you were playing sort of. I mean, obviously the sound centers on the Kolkata scene, right? But if you were going to play, like, I guess Dresden Streams is a good example, right? Dresden Streams is kind of like heathen black metal with some kind of raga scale stuff happening, right?
Yeah, which makes sense.
Yeah, and this is like kind of like that. This is sort of neofolk with some in cool infusions of Indian style harmony, and the baseline guitar music probably has more to do with with finger picking as a technique and with like European folk song than a lot of neofolk does. This is very, as far as stuff like this goes, this is very kind of riffy, and I think that relates. I think his whole way of conceptualizing this music has as much to do with black metal as it does with neofolk.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important distinction. I'm actually interested to hear your interview with this guy, because I have theories about how he kind of came to this style of music. Because I think that this may be a case where, this may be me grasping at straws. I could be completely wrong, but my guess from listening to this is this may be a guy who arrived at neofolk sounds through black metal rather than vice versa. I feel like this is a guy who, especially, given the cover songs at the end of this record, this is a guy who got in touch with these sort of folk-oriented songs through folk-oriented black metal, and then decided to make music sort of using that as the primary idea. Which is interesting because obviously that immediately gives it a different structure and a different tone in general from most neofolk.
As acoustic, as stuff like that goes, it's relatively riffy. He does 2 black metal covers at the end. One is from Kveldesanger, which is, the Ulver folk album, right, or acoustic album. And the other appears to be a black metalization, or a folkization of a Hordem Reif song. And
which is a very interesting choice.
They're very sort of down the line, they're like sort of imitation of late 90s second wave Norwegian stuff, as far as I remember. They're
neo trenchcoat. Yeah.
It's kind of like
possessions type shit.
Yeah, not a big fan of that sound particularly, but but he makes it sound, I mean, hearing it here makes me want to revisit it because the bass chords are cool. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we should play some, but I think some preliminary bullshitting was probably in order for something like this. I think this could well have something for metal people as well. So let's go to I suppose I'm going to have to ask him about the characters this is written in. I know that this script is used in India, but is this Sanskrit script? I don't know.
In terms of what the script is actually called, my Indian friends have just called it kind of like Hindi script, but they're usually second generation, so I don't know a proper name for it.
I'm sure I'm sure there's something about this. But basically we can't read the track titles. And so this is track 3, and this is just under 3 minutes in. It's restrained but skillful guitar work, and listen to his, because there's nothing flashy being done, right? It all depends on his ear. So listen to the very precise choice of intervals and the way that every time one of the basic phrases repeats, there will be kind of a subtle change in the notes in the chords. Yeah, so I think that's a pretty good example of this sort of ear for kind of pensive, melancholy, Central European kinds of melodies. Right? It sounds kind of like sad Germans, right? Or It's he has a. You could hear hopefully the refined interval choice happening there, and that little that sort of slide he does, right, is again a person who can play acoustic guitar gesture as opposed to a person who cannot play acoustic guitar but has chosen to play one gesture.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. This is clearly a guy who has a lot of experience on the acoustic guitar as its own instrument, not just a way to... Not an electric player who is switching to acoustic,
or
specific...
Or a sample, like a synthesizer user switching to acoustic.
Yeah, no, there's specific techniques, these little, the little trill at the ends of phrases, as he is sliding into the beginning of this riff, so to speak, again, is something unique to acoustic guitar, that relies on the resonance of that instrument that you can't get from electric, which is the problem with a lot of acoustic stuff on, black metal records, is the fact that, they're really just electric riffs that you're playing on an acoustic guitar. You're not recognizing that as a separate instrument, but on this record, this is a guy who really does recognize the fundamental difference there and uses it to its fullest potential.
Yeah, he's interested in the space around each note, for instance. This, for a first recording, or at least by this project, this sounds really good.
This is very nice, yeah.
The production is really good. And... there's a confidence in the melodic ideas being presented in the way that he lets each note sort of just hang, right? Mm-hmm. You could push the tempo faster, right? No. The string arrangement is good and simple. Something it reminds me of specifically would be San Hagal, who I think most people agree are one of the best latter-day neo-folk bands, where it's obviously neo, but it does have a relationship to real sort of European folk music. They're German. They release records very infrequently. Hopefully we're due for a new one soon. But Ackerwasser is the last one. And they have sort of dense arrangements, which helps in the kind of, in a genre that's often all too sparse, right? So here, the nice use of using the sort of the strings that just sort of flow in there is a very San Hagal thing. Same with that sort of sad Germans in the forest kind of vibe.
Well, I guess something I'm interested in asking you about, because I am big surprise not informed about neofolk at all. I feel like in a lot of the neofolk I've heard, it tends to be primarily vocal-driven music with guitars or whatever folk instruments as a sort of backing texture. Obviously a lot of those melodies can be very nice, but I've always felt like the primary voice in a lot of neofolk is vocal. Here, the guitar is throughout every track, clearly the centerpiece. Am I off base in saying that, or...
No, I don't think so. It's certainly, there's one thing that's interesting about, say, the confidence on this record is that although the guitar arrangements are sparse, there are no vocals on it. So, or not none, but there's not a steady, there are vocals that are interesting and worth talking about in your next sample. But on a lot of these songs, there's no sort of, the interesting thing about them is there's no standardized vocal line that continues over the music, right? Metal doesn't particularly emphasize vocals in the way that, say, some neofolk does, right? But there's still a default vocal line that continues through a half or 2/3 of the track, right? Or 100% of it, that layer isn't here at all. I think in terms of being vocal focused, something like Current 93 is very focused on a sort of unique, charismatic vocal performance. A lot of the other stuff, not so. I wouldn't say I don't know. A lot of the, like Doug Pierce is not like a conventionally good singer, nor are the lines particularly catching. I don't know. The Tony Wakeford is like deliberately kind of a bad singer. I think a lot of that stuff is you're supposed to listen to it very much in the aggregate. Mm-hmm. Like because the songwriting principles come from industrial. If anything, with a lot of that stuff, Wakeford stuff, Sol Invictus does sound more folk, especially as it goes along. But
that's a band that I know. All right.
yeah. As it gets more like, yeah. So I mean, brain fart. Point being, a lot of the canonical early neo-folk stuff really should be listened to as like ambient or industrial music, where some of the focal point, if anything, is often on the things that seem like extras, like samples or atmospheric noise stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that'll kind of get to my sample, the idea of these extras. So, like I said, as a guy that knows very little about this style of music, apart from, I don't know, I like Rome. I like Dead Can Dance. Are those neo-folk? I don't fucking know.
Dead Can Dance is neo-folk. I think Dead Can Dance spent their whole career studiously not noticing neo-folk. While probably noticing it. However, I think they also had a huge influence on that scene. I mean, Dead Can Dance is kind of like what if neo-folk, but like seriously talented musicians.
Okay, and Rome is Rome neo-folk?
Yeah, but he took it more in this kind of singer-songwriter direction, which I think love-hate relationship with.
Okay, so I have no idea what neo-folk is in that case. But, so, like you said, focusing on the extras. So I want to go to the fourth track. There's some... So, like you said, this is not really like vocally driven music. And even more than that, this is not driven by harsh vocals. But here is a section of harsh vocals over this acoustic music. And typically, when black metal bands try to do that, I usually find it kind of silly. But here it really lands. A lot of this music has this kind of dry, arid quality to it. There's almost this like desert sensation to it. And I think that works with his vocals, which have this kind of brittle, ghoulish quality to it. So you're going to hear some really cool methods of implementing those kinds of vocals over this music. And then we're going to get into more of this intricate folk music with a really interesting kind of pseudo key change when a flute comes in. And I think this one really stuck out to me as probably my favorite track on the record.
My aching
So there's an interesting kind of head fake thing there, with the vocals are so kind of like intense and ostentatious. You think that's going to be the foundation of the rest of the song. This sample comes about a minute in, so you're thinking maybe that's an intro and maybe this is the focus of the rest of this track, but it's actually not. You've got this kind of languid yet harsh vocal passage. It's a really interesting vibe there, but then it kind of dissolves back into the guitar, and then you realize, oh, the focus is this like arcing flute melody that manipulates the guitars under it as a result. Structurally, it's really interesting to me. This really grabbed my ear when I heard it.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely one of the highlights. The vocals are they're really cool. Those are the kind of black metal vocals you like, right? They're very Attila.
They're theatrical in the right way.
Theatrical in the way that you could imagine odd vocals in a traditional folk setting being. Like, sort of storytelling. It's almost like storytelling and taking on the role of a demon or something.
Well, it's interesting because, at least the first line there is in English, which I thought was interesting.
What did he say?
My aching bones.
My aching bones, yeah. I didn't even pick up on that.
I heard that. I was like, well, that's very distinctly English there, and I think the rest of the vocals on this record are in Hindi or some sort of regional dialect.
The dry sound is definitely good for that because it gets this sort of like rattling, deep resonance to the vocals, and then it drops out over some throat singing stuff, which again seems convincingly conjures up sort of like mountain storyteller kind of vibes. But yeah, they're good, and those would play well on a black metal record too. If you mic'd them, they'd be really heavy. But here they're almost whispery. Also, you can hear the kind of riffiness in the guitar playing. He's using raga scales there in the middle, right? Ding 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 ding, right? Those are but they're kinds that you would hear on a black metal record even in '93, right? Like Enslaved has been using melodies like that since, well, we were just talking about Viking Layer Veldi. I'm pretty sure there are melodies like that on there.
Yeah, I mean, it's all reaching back to primordial Indo-European stuff, so.
Yeah, for sure. There's
we always talk about that weird similarity between kind of like old Indo-European stuff and, Celtic music and blues, all of these kind of scales interrelating.
Yeah, well, I mean, Celtic stuff has that Indo-European root, right? Blues does not, and yet they converge, right? Around sort of. But blues, I wouldn't say blues has anything to do harmonically with this particularly.
No. Just you get certain
just follow certain
like those passing tones,
follow certain scales back to their roots, right? But here, so here there's this. It's a language that works in Indian music as it works in deliberately ancient sounding metal, right? Or the classic example is the Bolzer riff, right? But yeah, so it's not, and there's something cool about that. It's not hitting anyone's, although he's really interested in the regional stuff, he's not hitting anyone over the head with it for novelty. And there's a version of a band like this, right, that is highly, you could do a band that looks vaguely like this on paper, right? And it could be, Bandcamp Daily, Pitchfork, whatever, right? NPR interview. This is clearly not that at all. And, there's nothing to prove here and nothing to, no self-exoticism. Which is cool. As far as, let's go to the fifth track, right? This is, as far as that sort of blending places where, European and Indian music sort of converge around a common root. Well, that last riff was a good example of that. Here's an example of stuff that sounds very European being layered with stuff that sounds very Indian. in an interesting way. That slide down at the end is really cool.
Oh yeah, that transition into the final riff on that sample is really awesome.
And that is extremely metal. That's a pick slide, basically. And it drops down to drops from a sort of like key change flight, drops down to drone root note in exactly the way a black metal song does. And you can hear him at the end. That riff was also at the start. That's not folk guitar. That's a riff. And that's a black metal riff basically, and you can hear him sort of patiently building it phrase by phrase when it drops back in. Because like all the other stuff, it's made of these sort of understated, delicate little musical, like 4-note sequences, right, or 6-note sequences or whatever. You can hear how the whole thing that someone might write as a continuous tremolo line, he just here's the first phrase, here's the second phrase, here's the third, here's the fourth, and you can just basically watch the riff sort of
materialize.
Yeah, you can hear him building it in front of you in a very material way, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, he's kind of like taking black metal melodies, disassembling them into arpeggiated phrases, and then it's like half of a track is about reconstructing that riff from beginning to end.
I like that. Yeah. It's and there's a way that I don't know if he wants to do this, but he could easily record most of the songs on here as black metal tracks, not to do a replacement version of this record or anything like that, but it would be such a different way of playing them from the original that it wouldn't even sound like, it wouldn't be like some corny Gorgoroth re-recording or something. It'd just be interesting to hear how some of this sounds as black metal riffs. A strong part that neither of us ended up sampling, maybe because I thought you'd pull it or something, is a nice area with some, maybe it comes in right before the harsh vocal sample you took, some nice area with meshed female, really cool layering of female vocal samples.
Yeah, I got a little bit of that on my sample, but yeah, it peaks out in fits and starts. I mean, part of what makes those moments so interesting is the fact that so much of this record is dedicated to very isolated, spare acoustic guitar. So when a new voice kind of emerges, it's a dramatic moment, even without, a dramatic kind of transition within the riff itself. But usually those are compounded onto each other, which makes for these big, very, again, kind of black metal swings in in emotion and theme, which is really interesting. Like, this is basically, in a lot of ways, like an acoustic black metal record. More than, like, structurally, you know, based on the sounds that we're hearing, yes, this is a neo-folk record, but I feel like the heart of this really lives in black metal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I mean, I could have said this up front, maybe. There's a possibility he simply doesn't listen to neo-folk proper. But I think that certain parts of it, especially on the big, like that first sample you took, the kind of strummed chords there, like sort of like, I don't know, it's been a long time since I played acoustic guitar, but those kind of like dense, droning sort of, I don't know, like sustained sus chords or whatever that he's doing. That's a very Death in June thing to do. You could, I guess, get tones like that in black metal, but it's there are certain parts of it that does sound like he listens to neofolk, but you could have something very much like this album just from listening to black metal.
Yeah, and speaking of black metal,
yes,
yeah, I had the segue prepared. We're good.
I was like, okay, that's enough from me. I was trying to help you out.
Oh, well, thank you, black metal guy. But seventh track, second to last, an Ulver cover. Osten for Sol og Vesten for Mane, something like that. So I think that we've been slowly coming around to the idea that maybe much to our chagrin, Ulver is more important than maybe a lot of underground people have given them credit for. And especially here, you know, stuff off Kveldsanger, which is the record this is a cover from. This could be obviously material to a lot of folk and neofolk, because especially with the direction that Ulver went later on, experimenting with neofolk, industrial, ambient music, etc. They've always been kind of connected to that scene.
Ulver has always been keen to demonstrate how little metal they listen to. The one in a band whose career is composed entirely of gestures, the one cool gesture he ever made was wearing the coil chaos magic version of the Black Sun on the back of his jacket.
Natten's Madrigal is still great.
All right, so okay, well, we're probably gonna so you've heard our feelings on Ulver. However, we cannot deny that for the first three records they were very talented musicians, right?
Yes, they were. So let's listen to some of this cover. I guess one of the interesting things about hearing this cover is it actually kind of brings into relief. We talked about how this, in a lot of ways, sounds more like European folk than what we might expect. But hearing this very directly Nordic folk song played against the rest of the material on this record shows that, there actually are bigger differences than maybe we perceived up front, Because obviously this sounds radically different from the bulk of the material on this record.
Well, it's what would you think? What would you think constitutes the difference?
I just think certain melodic intervals, the interplay between the riffs on the Ulver track is extremely different. The structuring, the way different elements emerge and disappear is very different from what you hear on the rest of it. I guess it really comes down to primarily structural differences.
Yeah, his stuff is, I would say that the basic harmonic ideas are pretty similar. His stuff is much sparser.
Yeah.
But I think that's the difference between sort of folk and neo-folk. I get what you mean. There is also a possibility that some of the things that we are hearing on as Euro folk on the acoustic stuff actually have some precedent in Himalayan music, right?
Absolutely.
It's but yeah, the vocal stuff that I was talking about is actually on this, right? That sort of nice sequence of layered female vocals is on. I didn't realize that was the Ulver cover.
There's other moments of female vocals throughout the record, but they're the most obvious here.
There's nice overlay of them, I think, here. They're that's some specifically neo-folky kind of sample mongering, where you're using the, you just get you get someone to record a few little vocal patterns and you layer them into this cool kind of polyphonic thing. Yeah.
Well,
all right. So,
I mean, I guess the concluding thought is, where do you think this is going to fall on future records? Do you think it's going to go further into this kind of European direction, or do you think that maybe the Himalayan influence is going to come out more?
I think the latter would be my guess, because I think probably there's a challenge in how do you integrate the, not just generally subcontinental sounding melody, right? But the, sort of indigenous folk forms, right? Right, we're not talking just generally Indian here, right? We're talking intensely regional identity within that area, and probably identities that spread across national borders to some degree, right? So I think the fact that he's interested in the field recording aspect of it suggests he's very serious about. My guess is he would develop that side more in the future, but I think there's a question about how do you integrate it.
Apparitia.